Good evening and good morning. For those who I haven't met, my name is Dr. John Coyne. I'm the head of the Northern Australian Strategic Policy Centre here at ASPI. Welcome to ASPI and the University of Calgary's first of many, hopefully, Transcontinental town halls. Just as a quick sort of pointer before I get on some administrative points, right now across in Calgary, we have a live audience. We have our live audience here. And we've got a virtual audience plugging in from all the way from Canada to here in Canberra. A couple of points to start with before we get into the formalities of today. In Australia, the Indigenous voice is critical to any discussion on the development of Northern Australia. Unfortunately, today, our guest speaker to speak on Indigenous issues and First Nations issues has been unable to attend for unforeseen circumstances. I do want to sort of acknowledge that whilst that is the case, we continue to acknowledge the importance of the First Nations to Northern development, and that we commit to continuing to have First Nation voices in all of our future events. Secondly, today's agenda is packed full very deliberately to set a very firm foundation. As such, I'm going to throw some of the formality out. Our guest speakers today have very long and distinguished careers with very long bios with many, many achievements. I'm going to cut them short by doing very brief 1 to 2 sentence introductions. By no means is that to diminish those careers, but if you wish to have a look online, all of the bios for our speakers are available. With that in mind, I'd like to invite Justin Bassey, the Executive Director of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, to open this, our inaugural Transcontinental Town Hall. Thank you.
Thanks, John. It's great to be here. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional lands of the Ngunnawal people on which we are meeting, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and future. It is a real privilege to be here. And to have people both here and online and in Canada. It's an issue that is of importance to both our countries and to our regions. I'd also like to acknowledge the presence today of our 2 High Commissioners, Mark and Scott. Great to have you. Really pleased that you could join us, as well as Senator White. You will all add a lot to this conversation, and I'm particularly pleased that the 2 High Commissioners will be providing keynote addresses. There are significant similarities in the challenges facing both Northern Australia and Northern Canada. Infrastructure needs, weather extremes, population density, and geopolitical strategic significance are all characteristics shared by the northern regions of our 2 countries. A vast store of expertise and knowledge could and should be shared to contribute to securing a safe and prosperous future for both the Australian and Canadian North. Given the historical and continuing close partnership between our nations, we have an opportunity to learn from each other to maximise the impact of both research and policy. This event, hosted by the Australian Strategic Policy Institute's Northern Australia Strategic Policy Centre, in collaboration with the School of Public Policy, University of Calgary, will provide a comprehensive overview of the significant similarities in the policy challenges and opportunities facing both Northern Australia and Northern Canada. These similarities in relation to both our northern challenges and opportunities reflect the alignment and similarities we have across the board, whether it be in trade, technological development, increased aggression from China and other authoritarian regimes. In many respects, the bilateral relationship has been underdone, in large part because there are so few issues or irritants between us. The common challenges we face require us to push past this almost inertia that we have because we are so close and have so many commonalities. We need to work together on all of our issues, and the North is a great place to start. Our objective here is for this to not be the one and only, but to be the first of a series of collaborative events and research. Like all of you, I'm looking forward to hearing from all of our experts today. I didn't want to take up all of your time, so that's all I had from my respect, John. I'm looking forward particularly to hear from the two High Commissioners, and then hoping that we can use this to start a long and prosperous conversation. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Justin. With that ado, and the start, I'd like to now introduce Peter Mckinnon, who is the Interim Director of the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary. He was the Dean of Law for 10 years and President for 13 years at the University of Saskatchewan. And I will do my best to pronounce a range of names today in a very Australian way, so thank you. Thank you, Peter. We're in your hands. As you'd expect, starting off with a brand new format, there may be a few little glitches along the way, as our kangaroos and various other animals move rather quickly.
And
Peter,
the
if we
Métis
could-
Nation of
Can you
Alberta,
do it again?
Region 3. I have some personal sense of the importance of this Transcontinental Town Hall on Northern development in Australia and Canada. Earlier in my career, I was a visiting professor of law at James Cook University in Queensland, in the tropical region of that country. I will not claim to have traveled throughout Northern Australia, but I saw enough of it to be impressed by its vastness and the issues it presents in the world of public policy. Canada and Australia, as we know, are two of the world's largest countries, and they have in common northern regions that are larger than most countries. The issues that have been already mentioned of infrastructure, of weather extremes, albeit opposite extremes, population density, geopolitical, strategic significance, they're common to both regions and to both countries. Successfully addressing these issues will be vital in shaping their futures. I wish to congratulate the organizers with the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, as well as our School of Public Policy, for undertaking the hybrid initiative that we attend today. Thank you, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Peter. What I'd like to now do is invite His Excellency Scott Ryan. Scott is commenced as Australian High Commissioner in Canada in December 2021 and has kindly agreed to join our friends in Canada and Calgary, leaving the colds of Ottawa. Thank you.
Well, thanks, John. Thanks, Peter. It's a bit intimidating tonight. I'm at the first Transcontinental Town Hall. We've all got a bit used to doing this, but not usually in front of a crowd. We're usually doing it in front of our screen at our kitchen table or something, as the case may be. But it's good to meet some new friends, and it's great to see some old friends virtually back in Canberra. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's my first trip to Calgary. We had a bit of an interesting start, as you might be aware, in Ottawa earlier this year. But this is something that really interests me, because one of my interests in Canada, and some people in Australia may have heard this story, I'm looking at Justin there, that set my interest in Canada was an old university graduate, a supervisor of mine when I was a graduate student, who said to me, and remember this is the early 1990s, so it was pre-internet, it's hard to imagine, there are no two countries in the world with so much in common that have so little to do with one another. Now, I'm not a subscriber to the view the relationship is underdone. I think events like this are a testament to how it's not, because there are so many autonomous parts of this relationship that go beyond the foreign services of both countries. So it's about leveraging them and utilising them, and sometimes even knowing about them. So it's why it's a real privilege for me to be here. So turning to Northern Australia, considering all the challenges, the commonalities, the similarities and the risks, we can't ignore the history. In Australia, as our population grew, it huddled the shores, partly because of that being a temperate environment, primarily because that was also where the transport routes were in an era of sail. The southern shores were first settled, as we know, as a convict colony, and then one of the world's great resource booms, the Victorian gold rush of the mid-19th century, one of the largest of that century, drove our population further south. Encompassing all of this was a profound ignorance, mistreatment, fear, both of the regions, but also, of course, the tragic mistreatment of our Indigenous peoples, another similarity our countries share. But it's always been in the national consciousness, both as a fear, a risk, but also as a huge opportunity. For anyone who knows the history of Australia, the centuries-long desire to turn the waters of the North inland, expressed through the Bradfield scheme, seem to still capture the public consciousness, despite constantly being shown to be uneconomic. But the distances involved are something that our people in our major cities don't always understand. I'm a Queenslander by birth. My dad was brought up there, but I didn't believe him when I was told that Cairns is further from Brisbane than Melbourne is, and there's still a lot of Australia to the north of Cairns. So we have so much of our population dispersed around 5 or 6 key cities, and that's one of the differences. But 53% of our landmass is what the Commonwealth is what is defined as Northern Australia in Commonwealth policy. It only holds 5.3% of the population. Yet it also takes 60% of our rainfall. So I can't speak to Canadian history, but overcoming that sense of history, that inertia, that establishment of the status quo is one of the challenges of this policy area. But it's also something we share in that it does define so much of our national story and so much of our national consciousness. And we're both now trying to leverage the opportunities that it can provide, address the legacy of our history, and deal with the risks that the new world environment poses. So what are the similarities that I think we should look at and that we can learn from? Well, I'll start with the legacy of Indigenous dispossession and mistreatment, which both countries will continue to work together on. Our agencies do work together on, and I think there will be a lot more of that coming in coming years. Obviously, and I'll have to deal with these somewhat superficially with the time difference, my apologies, and happy to discuss later, we are both exposed, albeit in very different ways, to the risk of climate change. Very different environments, but both particularly exposed in terms of how we adapt and how we limit the damage that causes. There's the infrastructure challenge. Again, they are different climates, but I did read a couple of pieces that criticised Australia's approach for moving from a nation-building approach to one that had a narrow vision of roads and rail. Now, that isn't necessarily something I would agree with. Nation building hasn't always ended well, particularly when peoples are on the receiving end of it. But at the same time, I think it is fair to say that in the post-COVID environment, in the new strategic environment, we are looking more at our sovereign capacity, whether that be in mining and processing of rare earths and critical minerals, or even manufacturing products that we might need for health issues. So I think that is a prism through which we can view, because we've had a particular focus on economic infrastructure like roads and rail and moving into social infrastructure. The weather extremes are something that the countries share, but they are a little bit different in the sense that a lot of the risk in Northern Australia is event, as well as a harsh environment. It is actually natural disaster, the constant threat of cyclone, the constant threat of flood in particular. Being relatively new to Canada, I was familiar with it intellectually and academically, but as an Australian, the first time you feel minus 34 degrees in Ottawa, it is an eye-opening experience, or closing experience as the case may be. Your climate has all those huge threats, but they are of a slightly different nature because it is permanently harsh, if I might say. Ours is difficult, but modern technology, I'd suggest, makes it a little easier. The movement of people and population has been a constant challenge. It's a constant opportunity, but we do need to look at social infrastructure to make it more attractive. The geopolitical significance of both regions is also important, although it is slightly different in the sense, historically, your region, Northern Canada, was more critical during the 1940s to 1990s and the Cold War. Australians will be very quick to remind everyone that Northern Australia was in fact contested in World War II in 1940s with the bombing of Darwin. But we're both now in a place where they are of particular interest. Ours facing a region of increasing contest and increasing economic opportunity with the growth ongoing decades-long growth in Asia, the challenges of the Indo-Pacific, and of course the increasing contest in the Arctic, which has been somewhat brought to public attention by the tragic events and the illegal events of Ukraine and Russian activity there in recent months. They're both resource rich. They both have the capacity to increase the capacity of sovereign nations like ourselves and like-minded allies to be more economically independent. But the challenges also have their differences. The energy challenge is different in a technological sense. Ours is, in all honesty, more economic. The Arctic poses a much greater technological challenge for energy. I mentioned the climate difference. In terms of people, we both have our concentrations, but the Canadian concentration is along the southern border, integrated with the world's largest economy. Ours is a historical inertia based around 2/3 of people living in the key cities of Australia and encouraging people to move and take advantage of economic opportunities. So what are the areas where I think we can really work together on? One is particularly developing social infrastructure to make these places easier for people to live. The dream of, well, in some cases in Australia, historically, you can read stories about the dream of hundreds of thousands of people moving to inland Australia. That is not likely to happen anytime soon, but we do need people there to take advantage of increasing economic opportunities for us, particularly in resources and food production, but also in both countries for resources and for energy. And that means we've got to do a lot about housing, health and schools, that social infrastructure that people take for granted, but people also have an expectation of. We also have to address that social infrastructure, which still our Indigenous peoples are lacking to the standards they should expect in a country like ours. I mentioned before the issue of roads and rail and sort of core economic infrastructure versus nation building. The key thing is, in Australia's case, making it more resilient. And again, we can talk about cooperation in other spheres where, despite very different physical environments, some of our agencies can actually share the challenges. And one of those, for example, was vaccine delivery and cold chain maintenance to vulnerable Indigenous communities when we were trying to get out, vaccinate our way past the first stage of the COVID-19 pandemic. Very different environments, but similar challenges in dealing with them that our agencies could actually talk about. I mentioned before defence, and the changing environment in the region has meant that we both now have similar challenges with our northern regions. And they, I think, will continue to drive parts of our relationship that have been growing in recent years and, in my view, will continue to grow. What are the key opportunities for Australia that I think are a little bit different? Our north has a high prospect for food. Like you, we are a net food exporter. The world is about to go into a serious crunch on food and food prices and food supply. Our north actually has the capacity for substantially increased and ongoing food production, particularly in horticulture, because it's one of the few places in Australia where we can actually capture a lot of water. What are the key risks? Well, the key risk is in many ways a reluctance or an inability to follow through on long-term plans. This is not something that takes even the life of a government over a very long-term government. This is something that has to go for decades. People are not going to move, invest, or live somewhere where they don't think that there is a long-term commitment to a plan that's been announced and to resourcing it. The other challenge is that costs aren't controlled. And we've had ongoing challenges in Northern Australia, particularly with the examples we've used of defence estate building. It's not something we should look at, I saw some writer reflect on, as being too hard. We just need to view it as different. And it is. You're building a long way from urban centres, labour is shorter, it's harder to get supplies there, it's a different physical environment. We need to conceptualise that slightly differently and understand it's different, rather than try and apply a prism of building highways and railway lines as we might in our key regional centres or urban centres. I also think we've got to highlight again here that we need to work with our Indigenous peoples. There is a legacy of distrust, for very good reason, and generating their consent and their involvement, and quite frankly, utilising their unique knowledge and perspective of these regions will only further strengthen our ability to develop the North. And I would finally suggest that maintaining public consent will mean maintaining cost control, because none of this will happen in democracies such as us unless we have public support, public consent, and occasionally even just public acquiescence to the necessary redirection of resources that we're all undertaking in the new strategic environment, but that developing our northern regions will take from the private sector and from the public sector. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency. I'd now like to invite His Excellency Mark Glauser. He has been High Commissioner of Canada to Australia since October 2019, to give us a few opening remarks. Thank you.
Thanks very much, John, for that. Justin, for the opportunity here. And can I also acknowledge the folks in Canada, Peter, Mckinnon. We have a shared history with the University of Saskatchewan. It's always good to be able to acknowledge an alumni status from that perspective. Scott, my good friend and colleague in Canada, has laid out a number of things already. Key themes, obviously Indigenous related, climate related, opportunity, risk, and the history, and there's similarities across all of those things. So let me, from this vantage point, make a couple of observations about this proposition, which I hadn't spent a lot of time thinking about before in terms of the parallels, but obviously there's some differences, but the similarities, as Scott was pointing out, are legion. Obviously, everybody notes the main difference, to get it out of the way first, is the weather, the persistent heat versus a lot of cold. The joke in Canada typically is that there's no bad weather, just bad gear. But there's a kernel of importance in all of that, which goes to adaptation. And through all of this, through the history of the peoples that have lived in Canada's north over the centuries, indeed millennia, that's been core to the story. Let me get a bit of a frame of reference onto the table. This will be very familiar to Canadian ears, but probably helpful for Australian ears, just to understand a bit of the context and maybe one or two facts and figures to the things that Scott was alluding to. For Canada, the North generally means our three northern territories: Yukon, Northwest Territories, and our newest, Nunavut, although there are parts of the Canadian provinces, the South as they would be known in the North, that would also be captured in this. It's all very, very big and very, very sparsely populated. Nunavut, for example, if it were a country, would be the 12th largest country in the world. Islands all the way up to the North Pole, with a population of just under 40,000 people. The total population of all three northern territories, about 120,000 people, over 3.6 million square kilometers. Again, to Australian ears, this will resonate in terms of the Australian North, with the populations largely focused in the capital cities. For example, Whitehorse, the capital of Yukon, 24,000 people, 75% of the population of Yukon. We talk about the remoteness. Many communities are remote. Nunavut, for example, 24 out of 25 communities are on the coast. By that we mean the Arctic coast. And none of those 25 communities are connected to the south by road. All resupply is by sea or by air. And as you start to think of social infrastructure, economic infrastructure, the challenges, the public policy challenges, those kinds of frames of reference give life to the conversation. Obviously, being north in the summer, the far northern communities can have weeks without sunset in the summer. They can also go weeks without sun at all in the winter. That will have other implications, and I'll come to them in a second. We talked, Scott talked about the history. Obviously, from a population perspective, the history of the Canada's north goes back 10, 15,000 years. Indigenous people, with mainly Indigenous people still across the north, although the distribution differs a little bit from one territory to another, with many, many languages spoken. Europeans arrived maybe 400 years ago. The Indigenous part of that story, as Scott has alluded to, has had some real difficulties. It's changed significantly over time, obviously from the perspective of many, the better but not better yet. In the 1950s, for example, many families were moved and resettled to the high Arctic. In 2010, the government apologized for how those families were treated. So the story continues to unfold. In Canada, We've been doing comprehensive land claims agreements since around 1973. Various parts of Canada have been subject to those agreements. Nunavut itself was created in 1999 based on a 1993 land claim agreement. Others have been negotiated and concluded over the decades. Others remain in progress. Those are part of the foundation for the conversation of economic and social infrastructure and governance in the North. Another thing to just point out quickly in terms of the ongoing place of Indigenous people in Canada, I would note that our current Governor General, Her Excellency Mary Simon, is our first Indigenous Governor General. She's from Nunavik in northern Quebec and a native speaker of Inuktitut. So a little bit on the economy and infrastructure, which Scott touched on, and Justin, you referred to a little bit too, and as did Peter in his opening. In Canada's north, the economy is a mix of mining, fishing, tourism, and other things important to the Canadian fabric of Canada, like the arts. The minings and other extractives, depending on the part of the north that you're talking about, could be diamonds, where Canada's the third largest producer in the world, a wide spectrum of minerals, already mentioned as of increasing strategic importance, but fundamentally important to the economy, oil and gas. Mining, for example, is 25% of the GDP of the north, and 4% of the worldwide exploration spending takes place in Canada's north, a huge issue. Fishing, obviously, both subsistence, traditional subsistence and commercial is important. On the tourism side, a lot of national parks and increasingly cruise ships that can go through the Arctic when the sea melts. Again, climate change presents challenges and opportunities, all of which need to be managed carefully. The remote communities that have been referenced, obviously a range of important needs: transportation, energy supply, telecommunications, small-scale infrastructure, given the nature of the communities, all of which all present opportunities in terms of, for example, alternative energies or the cultural industries. There's about 3,500 businesses across those Canada's north, those three territories, most of them small, but that provides an opportunity for economic development and engagement. And just to remind at the start of the conversation, when we're talking about this economic development and social infrastructure, all the rest of it, all of this is an Indigenous conversation, given the nature of the populations, and all of the consultations that Scott was talking about being important in an Australian context are also similarly important in a Canadian context. So when we're talking, for example, about opportunities in those communities, on renewables, for example, where you've got off-the-grid communities that are reliant on diesel generators for electricity, as we work on things like solar power in the summer months, the kinds of consultations that take place with those communities on economic and social development are important. Foreign policy, national defense issues already previously referenced. The Arctic is increasingly important from a foreign policy perspective, and there's lots of infrastructure for the conversation amongst Arctic nations. Worth noting that the Arctic and Antarctic conversation is taking on a bit more importance, but that's probably for another day. And the military history of the Canadian North has already been referenced. So during the Cold War, obviously the DEW line, distant early warning radar sites, were key for managing that part of the North American continent. Again, that conversation has picked up again. On education, obviously dealing with remote populations from a social infrastructure perspective, you can think of something like the Yukon College with 13 campuses across the Yukon, how education is provided to remote communities, both in person and at a distance. And again, parallels with how Australia deals with education. From a federal government perspective, just a couple of points to flag. There's obviously been a lot of federal government attention to how the North is supported for many, many years. Let me flag two things. So an organization, for example, called CanNor, which looks at, among other things, strategic investment in the northern economic development and economic opportunities for the Aboriginal population, basic adult education, all examples of the kinds of things where specific initiatives are undertaken by the federal government to provide policy supports. Or Nutrition North, which has been in its current form since 2011, to help make perishable, nutritious food accessible. Obviously, given the distance, nutrition from a supply chain perspective is a significant conversation, and how consultations take place with the North, with those communities to make that both cost-effective and culturally relevant and appropriate. So just in closing, there's a lot of stuff that's been put on the table so far. It's a bit of a taster menu of a conversation which will probably go on beyond today. Populations with small capitals and remote communities, transportation and access, education and healthcare, economic opportunity, significant Indigenous conversations that are part of every one of these conversations, economic opportunities, the arts, things that are core to our identities as nations, which come from our North. A huge opportunity for the conversation. Thanks very much to ASPE for making this happen, and hello to my friends in Canada. Thanks very much, John.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mark. Now, our next segment, what we're going to do is start getting into our academics. And in some of the writing instructions, and I want to sort of highlight this, what we did is we said to our colleagues in Canada, and we enforced it on ourselves, as most of us are academics, we like to give hour-long lectures. I've given them a very strict guideline of 5 minutes for key points. So I just want to qualify before we start. Of course, there is a very long discussion from each of these experts in their own fields, but I've most definitely asked them to keep to 5 minutes so that we have time at the end for some discussions and Q&A. With that in mind, I thought we might start with the geostrategic significance of Northern Canada. And with that, I'd like to invite Dr. Whitney Lackenbauer to lead us off with our academic discussions. He is the Canadian Research Chair in the study of the Canadian North and a professor in the School of Study of Canada at Trent University in Ontario, Canada. We're in your hands, Whitney. And Whitney's joining us from a third location in Canada. What we might do is we seem to have a slight technical hitch here. So instead, we might move forward to Dr. Katarina Koch, who's our postdoctoral research associate in the Canadian Northern Corridor program in the Energy and Environmental Division at the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary.
Thank you, John, and thank you all for being here. This is really an honor to speak in front of you. And yeah, staying under 5 minutes. So I was asked to talk about infrastructure in Northern Canada in just under 5 minutes. So what I want to start off with is actually a problem. And when do academics do not start with a problem? So currently, Canadian Northern infrastructure development is challenged by its disintegrated approach with one-off projects which do not always include a long-term strategy for improving connectivity within and to the north. And in our research on the Canadian Northern Corridor concept, we argue that an integrated northern infrastructure strategy can address some of the key issues that northern communities are facing, such, for example, as a lack of access to basic services. We heard, for example, about the lack of access to basic health services. We also know in Northern Canada about communities that do not have access to clean drinking water, and also the high food prices in the north. And so our Canadian Northern Corridor Research Program is a multi- and transdisciplinary research program focusing on the comprehensive assessment of Canada's interregional infrastructure strategy, or the lack thereof, with the goal of advancing and facilitating integrated long-term infrastructure planning and development. But now we are facing another problem, because now I'm talking about integrated infrastructure development strategies. But the main challenge that we are facing in the Canadian North are the unique geospatial characteristics across the Canadian North and the Arctic. So in a way, we are talking about many Canadian Norths. We are talking about the near North, far North, the Arctic, and all the different environmental circumstances, the different people who live there, the different ecosystems, the different challenges. And so this is extremely important for me as a geographer to recognize this diversity of the Canadian North. And already in the Arctic and Northern Policy Framework that was published by the federal government in 2019, it was actually criticized that past one-size-fits-all policy approaches, which are sometimes developed in the South, for example, in Ottawa, they simply do not work in the North. Because, for example, in the North, if you think of engineering challenges, construction, we are, for example, dealing with permafrost. So constructing something up there is very different than, for example, constructing something in Calgary, for example. And that is why the Canadian Northern Corridor advocates for the inclusion of Northern voices and perspectives into infrastructure development policies, something which my colleague, Dr. Jen Sidorova, will also talk more about still. And so when we created this event, our idea was focused or based on what can Canada and Australia actually learn from each other. We share a lot of common problems, which the High Commissioners excellently already summarized, so I will not go into that. But we also want to deliver solutions. And it is our endeavor in our research to underline the importance of Northern communities and that we cannot afford to view the North as detached from the South any longer, neither in Canada and neither in Australia. The Canadian North, for example, is disproportionately affected by climate change. So we do need the Northern voices, the Northern perspectives, to learn from them, to simply help policymaking, to recognize Northern perspectives, to develop an interconnected North and South, while, of course, and this is very important, safeguarding the environment, the animals, and the people who live there. And so the Canadian Northern Corridor concept can be a key in the integration of Northern views into infrastructure policies and development. So just to leave you with a very short key message, recognize Northern diversity. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Katarina. I appreciate it. I know it's hard for our academics to keep to those 5 minutes, and I'm sure I'll be punished for locking you down to 5 minutes. Whitney, I see that you've joined us. I'm going to hand the baton on to yourself to lead us next.
Well, thanks. I hope I'm okay and audible now. I'm pleased to be joining virtually from Ottawa on Algonquin and Anishinaabe traditional territory. It's an honor to join in the first Transcontinental Town Hall and to share a few comments relating to the geostrategic significance of Northern Canada. First, Russia's further invasion of Ukraine beginning in late February has confirmed that Arctic cooperation is not insulated from drivers in the rest of the world. The idea of Arctic exceptionalism, that the region is somehow immune from global geopolitics, should be simply jettisoned as a lens through which to look at circumpolar affairs. Instead, what we've witnessed is the spillover of international attentions into the Arctic sphere, which raises fundamental questions about the longstanding commitment of all of the Arctic states to maintain peace and stability in the region. Accordingly, we need to be more careful than ever to base our decisions on well-grounded assumptions about Arctic defense and security to avoid unintended escalation or heightened tension. First, I don't see greater likelihood of conflict arising from Arctic disputes. So resources or Arctic boundaries or Arctic state sovereignty or shipping lanes, or any more of a threat than we did 3 months ago or 5 years ago. So the sovereignty on thinning ice narrative that continues to drive too many Canadian media and political narratives breeds misconceptions and misunderstandings. Competition between states is normal. It doesn't inherently mean conflict. So the fact that Russia and the Kingdom of Denmark and Canada have overlapping continental shelf claims beyond our respective EEZs doesn't mean that we're likely to fight over this in the Arctic. After all, Russia has the most to gain in the Arctic by any metric if we follow the spirit of the Ilulissat Declaration. And even its inexcusable aggression in Ukraine doesn't change this. So the framework that my team uses to sort Arctic defense and security threats is one of threats through to and in the Arctic. So the first category are threats that pass through or over the Arctic to strike at targets outside the region. And these generally relate to global strategic competition. These relate to things like advanced cruise missiles or hyperkinetic glide vehicles and ballistic missile submarines. It's salient that these weapons and delivery systems are not primarily oriented to strike at Arctic targets. They're strategic systems geared towards global balance of power and deterrence. So we situate these threats on the international level of analysis, not the regional security one. But that said, they have an Arctic security nexus because we have capabilities in the Canadian Arctic that are important to detect and defeat these global threats. This is a major focus of nascent NORAD modernization efforts that will see those upgrades to the North Warning System of radars, to forward operating locations that enable fighter intercept operations, and other northern infrastructure that bolsters domain awareness. But to suggest these are about defending the Arctic rather than about defending our homelands more generally is a misconception. Second category are threats to the Arctic. So threats that emanate from outside a particular subregion of the Arctic and threaten a particular subregion or location elsewhere. I'd suggest that outside of a general war, most of these threats to the Arctic are not conventional military ones. Instead, I might emphasize risks associated with misinformation campaigns designed to undermine the credibility of the Canadian state, non-like-minded state-owned enterprise takeovers of strategic resources or infrastructure, cyber attacks, or a below-the-threshold attack on a piece of critical infrastructure designed to create panic and force the Canadian military to direct its efforts and resources to dealing with that problem. We'd also include in this bundle climate change in a broad sense, as well as pandemics. Third category are threats in the Arctic. So this includes a basket of threats associated with environmental and climate change, such as permafrost degradation, coastal erosion, extreme weather events that threaten physical infrastructure, as well as major air disasters or maritime disasters. I see the threats in the Arctic as primarily on the soft security and safety side of the operational mission spectrum. So while our militaries are often called upon to respond to emergencies, it's problematic to simply lump these threats in with threats through and to the region. And it's best to empower our northern peoples with the capability to respond to these exigencies as much as possible in the Arctic. So to summarize, I see northern Canada as geostrategically significant, primarily as a thoroughfare, a theater through which strategic weapon systems may pass as part of broader global competition and deterrence. I do not see so-called sovereignty threats relating to shipping or legal disputes as a primary concern, despite the popular and political interest they continue to generate. Instead, we should situate threats through the Canadian Arctic as distinct from threats to and in the Canadian Arctic, which tend to be non-kinetic and fall below the threshold of armed conflict. And strategic investments in infrastructure, particularly connectivity, broadband and satellite systems, and transportation infrastructure, are key to address gaps and vulnerabilities in and to our Arctic. Thus, wherever possible, I hope that smart investments in Arctic defense and security are aligned with civilian priorities or provide dual use or military and civilian benefits. In this sense, geostrategic considerations can be synchronized with smart investments designed to address persistent inequities in Canadian civil society in the North. Thank you, Kuyanamik Masicho Marci.
Thank you, Whitney. What we'd like to now do is I'd like to introduce Dr. Jen Sidorova. She's a postdoctoral associate at the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary, sorry. I do apologise. And she will be leading us through some discussions in relation to Indigenous demographics.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I'd like to talk about Indigenous participation in Northern infrastructure development. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is Indigenous demographics in the Canadian North. So I would like to recognize that Indigenous peoples are diverse peoples with distinct cultures, histories, and languages. And there are many ways of self-identifying as Indigenous in the Canadian census. So as First Nations, as Métis, Inuit, and or as status and or as a member of First Nation band. So around 1,670,000 individuals in Canada self-identify as Indigenous, corresponding to 4.9% of the total population in 2016. Among the three groups, First Nations are the largest at 60 out of total, followed by Métis, which is 36% of the population, and the Inuit population, which is 4%. And Canada's Arctic is home to approximately 150,000 inhabitants, and which of more than half are Indigenous. Second thing I wanted to talk about is Indigenous engagement and the importance of the usage of Indigenous languages in Indigenous engagement sessions. So meaningful participation means that the Crown consults in good faith the existence of two-way dialogue, as well as there is an opportunity for Indigenous communities to participate in the process. So there are a few components that are essential when it comes to the usage of Indigenous languages in engagement with communities. So first is the recognition of effective communication component, because despite speaking English, people still prefer using their Indigenous languages because languages reflect Indigenous worldviews. The second component is trust, because trust contributes to raising cultural awareness among participants, and which diminishes barriers to cooperation. And also, the usage of Indigenous languages contributes to 2015 Truth and Reconciliation Commission goals and United Nations declarations of Indigenous peoples' goals and objectives. So Truth and Reconciliation Commission facilitates reconciliation between former students from residential schools in Canada, their families, their communities, as well as all Canadians. Truth and Reconciliation Commission began in 2007, and the final report was released in 2015, which is called Calls to Action. And UNDRIP received royal assent in Canada in June 2021 and came into force there. And the last thing I wanted to talk about is the importance of Indigenous knowledge and community-based environmental monitoring in the Canadian Northern Corridor concept. So Indigenous knowledge is based on long-term observations of Indigenous communities and observations of nature and transferred from generation to generation. And community-based environmental monitoring allows gathering and overseeing of environmental, cultural, linguistic, and social impacts led and conducted by Indigenous and local communities themselves. So there are 3 case studies that we included in our study of Canadian community-based environmental monitoring. They include berry pollution monitoring in Northern Alberta. They include water quality monitoring across Northern Canada. And the third case study includes caribou monitoring in Quebec and Newfoundland and Labrador. And also, we found out that factors that actually contributed to knowledge co-production community-based environmental monitoring included Indigenous leadership as a very important component, technology usage in monitoring programs, the presence of federal, provincial, and territorial funding, the presence of bridging organizations in the process, legal recognition of Indigenous and local knowledge, and the existence of legal space for community-based environmental monitoring. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Now, as the sort of MC of this and also being a speaker, I could be incredibly jealous or selfish, I guess the word is, and take more than my 5 minutes. But what I will try to do is endeavour to stick by my own rules. I'm going to talk about bridges and I'm going to talk about moats. And it's as simple as that. We've known in Australia since Federation and before that Northern Australia is geostrategically important to us. But hold on a second here, let's rewind. Even before the arrival of Europeans, Northern Australia was a gateway and a bridge. It was a bridge for trade, it was a bridge for relationships into the region. European arrival, there was very much an awakening in the halls of London that said, if we don't occupy this great northern land with townships, then someone else might come and take it. So it's no point having a moat if you don't have something on the other side of the moat. So we had these perilous towns that grew up in various parts of Northern Australia with little or no real supply chains. Many of them struggled, a number of them failed. And that's not to say that the North wasn't important or wasn't a great place to be, but the approach to it was, let's just plonk ourselves down on the edge of this moat and defend it. Fast forward, the 1930s, 1932, an imperial Japan rapidly asserting itself across the region. Canberra started getting very, very worried. with federation. And even from the point of federation, they were saying this northern land is a great opportunity, and we don't know how to do it, but we'll say it's strategically important, but translating that into real action is pretty hard. 1932, we had the warning. 10 years later, and it was mentioned earlier, 10 years later, the Japanese bombed Darwin. It sent shockwaves through the community. It sent shockwaves through government. People fled from Darwin, thinking that the moat had failed. Interestingly enough, we should keep that 10-year point in our mind. Cold War. Unlike our Canadian friends, and this will hurt many Australian strategists, we held important ground. So there's no doubt Pine Gap provided a very important capability during the Cold War. But for the most part, Australia was a strategic backwater in the great power competition of the time. And in fact, if we look to the late 80s as Australia developed its Defence of Australia doctrine, it really based itself around this concept that we would have more than 10 years notice to get things right. So all through that period of time was a period of moats, a moat to defend, a moat to launch from. Fast forward, as we enter a period of great power competition, a new period, we see a resurgent Russia in Europe. We see an assertive and rising China, even within the last several days, reporting of aircraft intercepts, which, for our Canadian friends will have sort of a Cold War ring to it in its own right. It's very easy to slip into this conceptualization of, and especially as we talk about the Indo-Pacific, the conceptualization of Northern Australia as, again, that place where we end and the moat begins. In stark contrast, Northern Australia is very, very different today. Its geostrategic importance does have something to do with geography, and I will talk to that, but it's a connection point. For the very start, Cairns has the world's largest expatriate population of Papua New Guineans. I suspect, whilst I don't have the data yet, the world's largest expatriate population of Timor-Leste citizens or ex-citizens, expatriates, reside in Darwin. A large number of Indonesians reside in Darwin. And we have strong multi-generational connections between Indigenous people in the Thursday Islands and the Tiwi Islands, etc. So there's a connection there. There is a economic connection. Australia provides through Ichi complex in Darwin Harbour. It provides energy security and gas to the Japanese government. We also see the Northern Australia as an aquaculture and agriculture protein hub for the region, with cattle moving out from Darwin Harbour, both in live export and in frozen, to Indonesia and across the region. Medical, major medical evacuations from the region, be they Canadian citizens as a result of bombings, be they Australian citizens as a result of tsunamis, or be they Papuans suffering, come back and are evacuated through our major medical centres in Cairns, Townsville and Darwin. Our north provides some of the world's best instrumented and widest capability in terms of military training activities. It's by no surprise that the Singaporean Armed Forces regularly have a presence in Northern Australia to train on those instrumented ranges. It's no surprise that the US Marines put a 6-month rotation through Northern Australia. We can't also forget, as I said before, the very clear geostrategic geography in terms of Northern Australia. Brilliantly, a book recently released by Rory Metcalf in terms of the Indo-Pacific has a wonderful map right at the start of it, which somewhat resembles that used by Indo-Pacific Command in Hawaii. Slightly tilt the Indo-Pacific that way, and right in the middle, right in the bottom is Darwin and all of Northern Australia. Walk into Indo-Pacific Command in Hawaii today and look at their planning maps, and it wonderfully shows all of Northern Australia. But we must be careful in conceptualising it just as a moat, as I pointed out. And I think this is one of the lessons that we can learn in terms of from Canada in relation to the Arctic. Secondly, Okay, like Northern Canada, and I want to really reiterate this, there are significant challenges in fully leveraging the geostrategic importance of Northern Australia. Not the least of which is that they do have an incredibly thin economy, which has very little surplus. In many ways, if you speak to military leaders, it takes 2 years to plan the logistics to conduct major exercises in Northern Australia, be they Pitch Black or be they Talisman Sabre, which are major multinational exercises. It takes a lot of work to do things in Northern Australia. And I'll finish off by going the other way, which is the Defence Strategic Update 2020, produced here in Australia, for the first time since the 1980s, made a very clear declaration around preparedness in this country, which was that for the first time since the 1980s, the likely warning time of a future major conflict is most likely under 10 years. Secondly, is we're not really sure if that under 10 years has actually started or not due to the nature of modern grey zone warfare. And as I finish off, I'll draw that attention. We had back to my historical example, we had 10 years notice in 1932 when the emerging Imperial Japan was asserting itself across the region. And then just under 10 years later, we had the catastrophe of the Darwin bombings. I don't want to leave on a negative stance, but simply put, there are a lot of opportunities in Northern Australia, just like there are in Northern Canada. The place is filled full of a buzz of entrepreneurialism and opportunity. But that needs to take into consideration the full picture, not silos of effort. Now, with that, I'm going to hand over to my colleague and friend, Jill Savage. Jill is a senior fellow with the Northern Australian Strategic Policy Centre and is often sitting through listening to me talk about the strategic importance of Northern Australia. So that's why she looked a little dazed.
Thanks, John. It's great to be here, and there are so many threads of this conversation that I could pick up. I'll do my best to stick to what I was planning to talk about. You know, we've seen in recent weeks from an Australian perspective that we are much more active in Asia Pacific, and there's this sense of us going there as opposed to others coming here. And I think we've talked a little bit about those, you know, reciprocal connections in terms of education and health, cultural connections, and so on. And, you know, it's really important that we recognise those and we appreciate those. But it's also important that we think about the local communities and the regional areas that we have in Northern Australia as a key part of Australia's economic prosperity, resilience, and national security. And for them to play their role, an appropriate role, they need to be much more robust, and we need to pay much more attention. For those who are not aware, in Australia we have 3 levels of government, and probably the most familiar level of government to citizens in Australia is the local government, the local council. They're the ones that look after local infrastructure. They're the ones who provide those local services for urbanites, things like waste collection and so on. It gets a little bit more difficult when you're in remote areas of Northern Australia. If you have a look at the annual reporting of the councils in Northern Australia, you'll see a common theme, and that common theme is potential and real financial unsustainability. You know, that's a really big issue if we're wanting to leverage the opportunity in Northern Australia. In 2021, the Queensland government did a review of local government authorities in that state, and found that around 60% of those local government authorities were of moderate or high risk of being financially unsustainable. A lot of local authorities are seeking grants to maintain local assets, basic roads, bridges, and so on. sinking loans to pay for maintenance of those assets. You know, that's a very significant challenge, I think, for Australia, if we're wanting to leverage the opportunity that John was talking about in terms of agriculture, mining, education, and medical services to others in our region. For me, that, you know, understanding that economics, resilience, and security start at the local level, if we embrace that and understand that better, we'll be able to aggregate that and leverage that for national purposes and national outcomes. It's too big a challenge to start nationally and work down. I really do think we need to start locally and aggregate along the way. The other thing I'd like to talk about is investment by other nations. And the US is investing heavily in Darwin through fuel stores and a range of other things. Singapore has a training facility in northern Queensland, and it is investing for that purpose. And likewise, Japan is investing in Northern Australia as well as other nations. From a security perspective, US in particular will have some expectations of Australia. One of those expectations is that we need to be able to operate year-round. There is a mindset in Australia that says that we can't, and I really find it quite interesting in Canada that, you know, I'm sure we've all watched even snippets of ice road truckers along the way. You know, what's possible is almost anything, and that's the kind of mindset that we need to apply to Northern Australia as well. But we tend to say, you know, 6 months of the year we can't. We tend to accept that our road and rail infrastructure will be flooded for parts of the year. And then we will repair that road and rail infrastructure so that next year it can be flooded again. Okay, so that thinking has to be challenged if we're really wanting to leverage the opportunity in Northern Australia. The other thing I'd say about our allies in particular is that they are keen to invest, but they won't invest in basic physical and social infrastructure. That's Australia's responsibility, and we need to understand that, and we need to create a foundation that makes it easier for them to do what they're needing to do in our northern region as a contributor to that prosperity, that resilience, and that security. So for me, this is about modern and contemporary nation building that is based on cross-jurisdiction and cross-sector collaboration to achieve a much more effective multi-use and multi-user approach that is going to enhance the livability, the contribution, and the opportunity in those local communities. Last message I'd like to leave you with is we need to stop saying in Australia we can't, and we need to focus on how we will. Thank you.
Thanks, Jill. I asked Senator Vernon White, who's a sitting senator with the Senate of Canada and also one of an international fellow here with our Strategic Policing Law Enforcement Program, to give a few words and then to chair sort of some Q&A at the end of this with the panel members. I did so because during his time here, he has come out and stayed with us for a number of months doing research. And I was always incredibly captured by this concept and him talking about the challenges of spending more than 2 decades in the Arctic Circle and the very ingenious ways as a member of the RCMP he solved, whether it be Indigenous recruitment issues or whether it be getting things done within communities. And that went on to his career in Ottawa. So I very much asked him today to bring that same level of can-do that Jill's being talked about into the next section And what we'll do then is, once Vern's had a few opening remarks, I'm sure he will steal the chair's prerogative and ask the first question, but then we're opening the floor to others. Senator White, we're in your hands.
Thank you very much. I think I'm going to sit if that's okay. I thought that was the plan, and John's lucky enough.
Vern, we don't have audio.
Can you hear me, John, okay?
I've got you better now.
Yeah. Anyway, I was always appreciative of the fact that in the Northern Territories of Canada, they actually have a can attitude and they can get things done. But I was actually listening to the commentary of the speakers, in particular Katrina and Jen, and particularly when Katrina talks about the inability for long-term development to occur. And I think we need to move into a cycle. And I guess the question I would have for Katrina is, how do we move into a cycle of infrastructure and development in our Arctic between governments? Because the biggest complaint from governments in the Arctic is the fact that they have to depend on a federal government lasting long enough to actually complete work. And often they would say that if we don't get it approved in the first year, we won't see it in the fourth year with moving and shipping cycles. So maybe, leveraging the Canor organization to try and look at long-term strategy, not unlike the actual procurement strategy that Australia uses for their military, as an example, that goes well beyond a campaign and well beyond a 4-year cycle of elections. So that's a question I would actually put to Katrina. How do we see that working? From Jen's perspective, because she talks about Indigenous issues, and my background is in policing, in particular with the RCMP in the North, and the fact that we today have a law enforcement and a criminal justice system in the 3 Northern Territories that neither meets the linguistic often or cultural background of the people that it impacts on. And how do we develop a criminal justice system in the North that meets the requirements of Canada's justice system, but meets the needs of the people who live there? We have whole communities that have a community of 500 people like Old Crow that have over 100 people with a criminal record for breach of probation for possession of alcohol. So a criminal administrative charge and conviction that ends up impacting on them often for the rest of their life, that realistically in the South would not occur. We have not actually developed a system, whether that's rolling out restorative justice practices or even understanding the historical significance of what justice looked like 100 years ago in those communities. And instead we've taken our own justice system, and I know because I was a part of it, and put it over the top of those communities. So my question there would be, how do we actually do that and move forward? And maybe it's, instead of trying to figure out how we fit what's happening in the Arctic into our system, actually deciding that maybe we need a new system. One that actually works for people in the Arctic rather than one that works against the people in the Arctic. Thanks, John.
Yeah, I can go ahead and maybe respond to John's first question. Thank you so much. That is a very important question, and one that we are certainly also tackling in our Canadian Northern Corridor research program. And I would totally agree with you that currently what we are seeing are localized, local projects in specific regions across the North, because one of the challenges, as you said, are the short-term election cycles and this, let's say, 4-year vision for Northern Canada. But we are not looking beyond 4 years or 5 years. And in the past, when, for example, the Transcontinental Highway was built, or even the Pacific Railway, these really large infrastructure programs, they were built based on a vision for Canada. So nobody was thinking down the road, like in 50 years, okay, what will be the economic benefit for it? But they were really built on a vision to connect Canada and Canadians. And what seems to have happened is that the North seems to have been disconnected from the South of Canada. So what we actually maybe need is sort of a vision. And this doesn't mean to bring the South to the North, like not at all. This means really listening to Northern voices, bringing the North to the South, learning from each other, and perhaps
with a long-term vision, we might also be able to tackle some of the long-standing issues that northern communities are facing since years and years, such as, for example, the lack of access to clean drinking water.
So I think that your question is very important, and I also understand it's clearly extremely important to address the issues of criminal justice in the North, specifically within the Northern Indigenous communities. I think one possible solution to that would be to recognize Indigenous law and Indigenous legal traditions that exist in every culture. As I said already, that every Indigenous community, every Indigenous nation has its own distinct and authentic culture, language, and of course, legal and governance traditions. And that's why it's very important to study Indigenous languages, because languages are key to understanding of cultures and languages. From my own study of traditional ecological knowledge, I know that every Indigenous language in Canada has its own meaning, its own conception of sustainable development. Like the Inuktitut has its own conception of sustainable development and a holistic development that could be incorporated potentially in northern infrastructure development. And when it comes to Indigenous legal traditions, I'm pretty sure that there are some Indigenous legal institutions that could be adopted as part of self-governance institutions in the Canadian North and the Arctic. And that's why the usage of Indigenous languages in engagement practices and the development of self-governance institutions in the Canadian North would be possibly a potential solution to address when it comes to the questions of criminal justice. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jen. What we might do is, are there any questions here in the audience before we start firing them off from online?
Question if you can, or a response as well.
Please.
Hi, my name's Brenda McAuliffe. I work with the Office of Northern Australia. I'd be keen to hear any views on how you may suggest we move from using a cost-benefit analysis when we're looking at investing and committing to infrastructure projects, and we really move to more of a strategic vision, which has been mentioned before, but to really look at it that way, because now we seem to be in a very cost-benefit analysis assessment of projects.
Look, I think that question, and I'm going to hand it to you very shortly, but I think that question really hits the nail on the head, both for Canada and for here, because we sort of describe it in our conversations over the last, I guess, 2 years. We've come to this point where, you're using a nation-building mechanism that's designed for an economy that only exists below the north of 26 degrees south. So, user pays sort of models, they work really, really well in Sydney and Melbourne, but they just don't work if I want to build a road between, Catherine and Darwin. And I think from that perspective, I think fundamentally we have to sit there and accept that paradigm shift. Secondly is that, and Jill, I'm sure will go into significantly more detail on this than I will, but I said it alone, that's hospital pass in football parlance. But I do think that this is where we see having to join bits of government. So, I've got a draft strategist piece that talks about it in the Australian sense. And I guess your office may disagree on this, but an office of northern coordination, which sits there between the various parts of government and also the private sector, because one of the complaints from industry, as an example, is that if I want to develop a rare earth mine and processing centre in some part of northern Australia, I have to pay, or indeed this is even if we don't talk about mining, let's talk about the proposal for by Twiggy Forrest in relation to his solar project in Northern Australia. So if he wants to build that, he has to build not only that, but he has to build the roads, the water, the accommodation, everything else. But if he was doing that outside of Melbourne or Sydney, the cost of that would be borne by a whole range of other partners. So I think there's this, in some sense, we have to come to some sort of model that pushes these things together to get critical mass. We certainly saw this in some projects and some promise of it. So, Jill and I looked at Townsville Harbour and some of the discussions going there where, You know, you've got private equities, you've got state government, federal government, and you've got, you know, emerging industries all working together, trying to plan how to and synchronize their work. And so I think there's some promise, and that I think is part of the future as well. I don't know, Jill, if I've hospital passed to you now about 3 things. So.
Thanks. A couple of things. The cost benefit analyses, I think, you know, governments love those. It is possible to integrate intangible costs and benefits into those arrangements. And I think more needs to be done in that context. I think we've drifted quite to tangible costs and benefits, and we need to drift back towards the middle so we embrace both. That requires a little bit of a philosophical shift for that to happen, because it needs to be valued and it needs to be understood. You know, likewise with what John was saying around that cross-sector, cross-jurisdiction collaboration, that's key, but the underpinning for that is trust. And the more work that we do in Northern Australia, the thing that is highlighted is that, you know, when business comes to a conversation, there's a little bit of a southern expectation, if you like, that it's all about commercial interest, to the exception and to the exclusion, and probably to the, you know, the cost of others. In Northern Australia, we don't see that. We see a stronger understanding of community. We see a stronger understanding of we're all in this together, and we all should be able to benefit. And we see a stronger trust relationship. And that was the really interesting thing with the work around Townsville Port, because the port came at it from the perspective of we have a whole bunch of people who want to use this. We need to understand where they're going so that we can provide an opportunity that matches their future benefit with our future benefit. Normally what would happen is that, you know, a port operator would say, we have a port. Come and use our port. It'll be good for you. They're designing it. I can't say from the ground up. Is it from the water up or for the trench up or something? To meet a whole range of different needs. And they're getting to the point that they are perhaps, including with defence, they're saying things like, well, if you can't actually commit to what your future might be for a whole range of valid and reasonable reasons, what we'll do is we'll create your part of the port in this way, so that if you want to use it in that particular way in the future, it won't be costly to retrofit. So, you know, that's real thinking ahead and really sort of navigating and collaborating for mutual benefit, in that case, national benefit.
I think there's also a piece on risk here, and this was a lesson we've learnt around from the Northern Australian Investment Facility, which is that the risk settings for the Northern Australian Investment Facility have traditionally been way too high. So what happens is that the really entrepreneurial people who've got real risk but real opportunities can't get money through NAIF, or traditionally haven't been able to. The people who then use NAIF to gain equity from the private sector never draw down on their loans from NAIF, because, you know, they become, as soon as they get that approval from
Which
NAIF,
is actually a good thing for the Commonwealth.
Well, it is a good thing for the Commonwealth, but I think it does tell a
way.
story around what it means is that our acceptance of risk is very low in this space. And I think that when you're talking about Northern Australia, I think we have to accept, and when you're talking about nation building, I think that you have to accept there's a great deal of risk in that. Otherwise, we would never have done the Snowy Mountain Hydro scheme here in Australia. You know, if you look at it on paper, it was a bold plan. If you look at how the workforce was developed, etc., it was extraordinary for the time. And to weave it back, and this is back to something that Vernon White's question and some of the comments here, there's also an issue here There's a tiredness that I've found in the work we do with Northern Australians, which is there's a cultural historical record of lots of promises over the last, or since Federation, lots of declarative statements about what will be done, and quite often, because it gets hard, changes of government, it turns, and I'm not criticising. What I'm saying is there's something there about making longer term commitments that's missing and that needs to be developed, and certainly picking that up from the Canada side. I don't know, Vern, if anyone on your side wants to comment on anything that Jill or I have said.
Do you mind if I jump in here?
Please.
Yeah, wonderful discussion here. I think going back to the Senator's first question, there's an issue of prioritization that to me is key. So where it's difficult in our respective federal systems is actually encourage those alignments between federal, state, territorial, provincial, and then local or Indigenous rights holders to actually figure out where you're going to have the appropriate sequencing or synchronization of efforts, because we can't be investing in major transformative infrastructure investments, for example, all at once. So I think that's the persistent challenge. This requires improved dialogue, new mechanisms, as we're alluding to here, to be able to achieve these synchronizations. I think part of it also has to be measured with this transformation in narratives. So to work towards this strategic vision idea, I think we need to change the way we're messaging a lot of this. I think Jill was onto something when she emphasized resilience. I think that's a very powerful tool that should be amplified in terms of the way that we're messaging these projects. And I think from a Canadian standpoint, the nation building language might be funny, given that Prime Minister Trudeau has declared that Canada is the first post-national state. And I'm not sure whether that same language will fit or can be deployed in a Canadian context the same way. But I think the notion of trying to bring Northern and Southern rights holders and stakeholders together to buy into a common vision is very appropriate, whether we call it nation building or something else. Thanks.
I've got a question about how the stereotype.
We have a question from here, John, if that's okay. Go ahead. Sorry, I can't. Lights in my eye. Oh, there we go. Thanks.
I have a question how we stereotype the North. I work with the teachers in Canada and a lot of time in the North. And I don't see water cities with Yellowknife and Whitehorse being in the North inaccessible. You know, we can run a truck out to Whitehorse now in 20 hours, move the water. Yellowknife is doing a bridge. And the stereotype goes with the example of McDonald's hamburgers. We truck them all over Western Canada. Why you go here to Winnipeg at 18 hours, the cost of the hamburger is the same. You go to Yellowknife at 18 hours, but $3 more an hour. Or a burger. So the stereotype of the North concerns me. When I first started working,
Murray was always in the North. Now it's a modern city.
Yeah.
It has all the facilities, and I sometimes wonder if we're not trapping ourselves that this is a different area that is sometimes, when we build it up, becomes just another Canadian city.
Well, and to be fair, you know, that's a great question, because to be fair, Whitehorse, they're not all created equal. Whitehorse, you can buy groceries cheaper than the city of Ottawa, as an example. So, and I think Nunavut is a different beast totally, where every community not only is not accessible from the south, not accessible to each other either. All 26 communities. I know I used to fly those for police work. And so it's a different story as well. But I don't disagree with you. I think we buy into everything's going to cost 3 times as much. So guess what happens? It costs 3 times as much. And I think part of that, though, as well, is the fact that our governments allow, and I'll use multiple governments, whether it's territorial or federal, allow that to continue, because I think we can look to other countries like the Scandinavian countries in their north, and they certainly do not allow that to occur in their north. That they actually control the pricing so that it doesn't run rampant. I mean, to build a duplex, 20 years ago, I built a duplex for the RCMP in a community in Clyde River, and it cost over $1.4 million to build a duplex. I could have built that same duplex anywhere in the south for about $300,000, because we allowed the market to bear of 3 people bidding on it, instead of pushing through and trying to entice developers from the south to actually be involved in developing the north. Same time, though, the North will argue if you're going to develop the North, it should be developed in the North. They want to be a voice in that discussion. I'm not sure we listen to the voices very well either. Please, yes.
I do have a question here from Ian on our online audiences. And he's asked about how do we better prioritise and plan social infrastructure alongside hard economic infrastructure for industry and defence. And where he's coming from with that is people are arguably the most precious and scarce resource for northern development. So I don't know, Jill, if you wanted to lead off on that. I might pass it over so you can quickly scan again. I think this is something you and I have talked about before. And sort of to give some context to this, there is this, while Jill's reading through it, we find this in the township of Catherine, a lot of work being done at the RAF Air Force Base Tyndall, long-term growth and economic activity. However, there's simply not enough housing, parks, doctors, schools to be able to support the workforce.
Look, I think for me, one of the big things is about forecasting intent and forecasting future. And, you know, that becomes a little bit difficult when you're looking at commercial activity. But there's no reason why government and government agencies can't do that. And I think that in terms of the example that you're talking about, John, also, Department of Defence is, I'll just say, terrible at forecasting intent. And, you know, when it's quite clear the direction that's headed, I mean, defence, it's hard to hide, you know. So local communities, you know, start to get a sense of what's happening and so on. But still, there aren't strong statements about what it will look like in practice, and that sort of the housing issue. I think the other thing is that, you know, in some areas, some state territory governments and some local governments are really trying to understand what's happening in their local area, but have difficulty penetrating other jurisdictions or penetrating into other sectors. And so for me, it does come back to having that lens around local and fostering collaboration within that local environment. And I think, you know, Townsville and Cairns are good examples of two areas that have created a collaboration corridor with a defence focus. And, you know, that is quite a different and quite a new thing for two local councils to do. There's a tendency to compete rather than to work together. So I think there are some good models. I think there are models that fit a local context, and I think that's the other thing about this, and particularly in terms of mining and rare earths. I do think that the mining companies are quite keen. You know, they are in it for particular reasons and purposes, but they do know there are connections with community, and they do understand the value of those connections. I just think, you know, it's a bit it's a bit of an old criticism, but we've got to break down the silos. You know, and people will tell you that the silos don't exist because we have coordination mechanisms. But, you know, I'm a former public servant, and I know that, you know, when you walk into a coordination committee about something, everybody brings their agency agenda, and they bring the silo that fits with that. You know, that's in any part of Australia, that is no good for our prosperity and our resilience.
No, and I think in Northern Australia, what it does create is, and I think for Northern Canada, I suspect it will be the same, which is it creates this uneconomic boom-bust cycle.
Yeah.
And we've seen this play out where, you know, housing prices in some of our northern centres go up to here, down to here, you know, shops close, they open, and I think that flattening out of that is really critical to the long-term growth. So when I talk about coordination, it's more like synchronisation and how to get that. So that what we don't get is, you know, a major mining project that's being built exactly the same time as something else is being built that then pushes the population beyond and the local industry base beyond its capability. And that requires a great deal more sort of transparency and longer term commitment, which is one of the things that Senator White alluded to. Look, we are now at our time. I very deliberately, with my colleagues here and also my colleagues in Calgary, we really wanted to provide a tasting menu to prove our concept that we can do more together as Northern Canada and Northern Australia. We very deliberately covered off on a whole pile of very different topics. And in doing so, I'm not going to pretend that I can sit there and sum up all these different speakers. Suffice to say, I want to say thank you to our two High Commissioners for coming along. Secondly, I want to thank Senator Vernon White. I want to highlight, many of my Northern friends have continuously said to me, John, why are you, and our supporters and interlocutors, why are you doing a Northern Australia event in Canberra? So I do want to make sure that the next Transcontinental Town Hall that we hopefully get Your Excellency to come with us to Darwin or Townsville or perhaps Cairns. But look, I know it's passé in Canberra, and it sounds like it's not a well-accepted term in necessarily in Ottawa, but I think with the guidance of perhaps the two High Commissioners, our colleagues in Calgary, and indeed Senator White, what I today call nation building and what's needed for nation building, perhaps we can find a term that works together, but I think the future of these town halls are two things, which is the first one is making sure that we're focusing on whatever that alternative word for nation building is. And secondly, is making sure that we get more of those Northern voices into this room so that it becomes, as I've seen them play out in Ottawa and other places, it becomes a true town hall of roaring discussion and some disagreement, the odd bit of laughter and a great deal of learning. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for your attendance. I'd also like to thank Grace Stanhope, who's my program coordinator here, who together with my Canadian colleagues made this possible, and specifically because she, just like Grace, has been forcing everyone about my 5-minute rule, etc. I'd like to thank Christine Verdnock, the Director of Community and Strategic Engagement at the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary, and also Kent, who decided to give up the opportunity to speak, instead to sit back and help conduct all these events. So a big thank you to you as well. So thank you very much. Unfortunately, because we're in Australia, I'm going to offer you tea and coffee. I think in Canada, because it's evening time, they're going to be having most likely beer and wine. So please, thank you very much. Join me in thanking everyone for being here, and let's have a cup of coffee and talk about Northern Australia and Northern Canada. Thank you.
Thank you.